Hello and welcome back to this special PS section on the parable of the talents, also known as the parable of the bags of gold in Matthew 25. And, I didn't mention this before, there is also a very similar story in Luke chapter 11 called the parable of the 10 minas. Now these stories are so similar, if you've read them you've probably thought they're effectively the same. In Matthew, Jesus is just talking to his disciples and he tells the story of a master who gives his servants heavy bags of riches or talents, enough to cover several lifetimes' earnings. We usually think that this master is like God. The good servants who use these riches are like what we want to be, and the wicked, lazy servant who buries his talent in the ground is who we don't want to be. You can debate the details, and that's kind of what I did in my talk just now, but you probably don't doubt the basics. However, you might be wrong, especially if the story of the talents is meant to be the same as the story of the minas, which has some small but potentially very important differences. For one thing, a mina isn't worth anything like as much as a talent. It's a 60th. So it's not nothing, and the master's still giving out big chunks of change, but maybe it's not life-changing, forget about it kind of money. It's enough to do a decent project or two, but it's not your whole life's worth. And one reason why that's important is it takes away one of the things I loved about the talent story that showed how much the master valued his servants before they'd done any investing. In the miner's story, he still values and trusts them a bit, just not so much. And on its own, that probably doesn't mean anything. But let's have a look at the master in the miner story, because Jesus adds a lot of details about him, and he's a bit of a character. First, he's not on some random trip out of town for a bit. He's a man of noble birth who's off to have himself appointed king. Hold on, is that how kings work? I thought they could just stay where they were and become kings because of who they are. But, Jesus says his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, "We don't want this man to be our king." Oh, well, now it's getting interesting. That really doesn't sound like how kings work. But you might be thinking, hold on there, theology noob. Isn't it obvious? This is about Jesus. He's talking about himself. He should be king, but the people hate him, and so they're going to make a fuss. We've heard this one before. Okay, now you might think you've heard it before, and it is how most of us have read this. But recently, some scholars have suggested the people Jesus was talking to were probably thinking this story was about someone else, someone specific that they recognised and didn't like. It actually sounded a lot like Herod, who had done this. He'd gone out of the area to seek Rome's approval to rule. Lots of people hated him and tried to stop it, but they didn't succeed. Not only that, when they came back, Herod had a nasty surprise for the people who opposed him. He had them all rounded up and killed in front of him. And that's a pretty memorable detail. And these scholars now think this actually happened. And Jesus puts that in the story. Luke 19, verse 27. "But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me." How did we miss that? Oh, again, if you were certain that this king is God or Jesus directly, you might have said, well, this is just judgment. It's harsh, but that's what it is. Don't oppose the king. That's the lesson. Or is it? Because if the people who heard this story thought they recognised this king as a bad guy they hated, they weren't thinking Jesus was encouraging them to follow him. They would have been hoping this was a story about opposing a bad king. And maybe it was. Because there are some other details too which would have unsettled the Jewish crowd. They weren't super rich. When they saw rich people making quick profits like the good and faithful servants in the story, they probably thought they'd made it by ripping people off, just like all the corrupt officials that they had to put up with and wanted gone. And if Jesus is talking about their country, which was an occupied territory at that point with a disputed and unpopular appointed king, anyone who traded on their behalf was supporting them and loyal to them, especially while they were away and their leadership was on the line. The good servants were basically loyalists to a bad leader that most people didn't like, and only brave people opposed, maybe at the cost of their lives. So, what about this wicked servant who hid the money away? Well, what he didn't do was put the money in the bank to get interest. But guess what? Jewish laws prohibited interest for money lending. These new banks they had, which paid interest, they were a foreign thing. Again, not the kingdom that they were looking for. What the wicked servant did was call his master a robber or a robber baron, reaping where he didn't sow. Everyone knew that's what that meant. And when we looked at the talent story, I said, I think that's corruption in this servant's heart. He'd had good things from a good master, but they started to look useless and bad to him when he buried his talent away. And I think that's all true if his master is good. But what if everything is the other way round? If his master is bad, his money's bad. The good servants loyal to him and ripping people off for quick profits, they're bad as well. The story only has one good guy, and that's the servant who didn't spend the money. Everything's upside down. He's the hero. He spoke truth to power at the risk of his life. And maybe that's the point of this story from Jesus. Don't buy into bad kingdoms. Don't spend talents or money with them, even if they give you the money to spend. I know, right? Now, they didn't teach you that in Sunday school, did they? And it might be a bit of an overstretch, at least for the talents story, where some of those details are significantly different, just in ways that we might not have noticed much or thought about much before. Now, I really love how Jesus' stories are strong enough for a few different meanings, and lots of good stuff comes out of them from different angles. But this is on another level. This story seems to accommodate completely opposite views about whether the master is good or bad, and what that means when the master gives us money. Now, I actually love how this new interpretation of the Minos story, at least, it seems authentic to how people might have heard it at the time. And it gets over the problems of how it was used later to support capitalism and profiteering as some God-given best way to live, apparently just ignoring the rest of the gospel. It's possible that the newfound enthusiasm for this way of looking at the story is a reaction against profiteering and in favour of social justice. And I'm going to leave it with you to decide whether or not you buy into it. Either way, I think it's safe to say that Jesus is encouraging us to follow God and to reject corrupt leaders who just pretend to be God. And we should do that with our wallets as well as our words. How we put that into practice now, I would love to discuss. I'll see you later. Hey Noah, I've got one amazing joke.
I've got one amazing joke as well.
Can I tell you my one amazing joke? My amazing joke is, I've forgotten. What was my amazing? We'll have to do this again.